Well, today it's my privilege to be talking to Bob Hartman. Bob is someone who many listeners and viewers to this will know well and won't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give a brief introduction anyway. And Bob, if I've got anything wrong, do tell me. Bob, you've been a professional storyteller for more than 30 years. You're a popular children's writer and performance storyteller and a regular at various events, including, of course, Spring Harvest here in the UK. Your books include the best-selling Lion Storyteller Bible, the Lion Storyteller Bedtime Book, and the highly acclaimed Wolf Who Cried Boy. Total sales of your books, I'm told, are now in excess of more than 1 million copies. So congratulations on that, Bob. That's quite some achievement. And you're also the author of the popular Bible app for kids, which is available on YouVersion. So is known by many children and parents right around the world, I'm sure. But having given you that introduction, I wonder, how would you describe yourself?
Usually I just tell people I'm a children's author and a storyteller. So, you know, I tell stories and I write them down, and that's pretty much it.
I tell stories and I write them down. Thank you, Bob. I love that. But I mean, tell me, how have you come to this point that that's how you describe yourself? What's been your journey?
Yeah, I was originally a pastor in a church here in the UK, in Leicestershire. This was 40 years ago. And my congregation was an older congregation. They knew their Bibles pretty well. So you'd start telling them the Bible story, and it's like they knew it. They knew, you know, what was going to happen. And that's never any good, really, when it comes to drawing an audience in. So I started telling the Bible stories from different angles, different positions, different characters maybe, with a view to engaging them initially and then hoping that they'd stick with me to see how it worked out, you know, that way. And somebody in the church just said, well, why don't you, you know, write some of these down and see if you can get them published. And eventually, yeah, that's what I did. So that's where it started.
Gosh, thank you. But what is it, do you think, about the story, telling a story that just engages people's emotions and their attention?
I think it's because, really, story is how we communicate with each other. Our lives are stories. When we sit down and talk to one another, we tell each other stories. You know, we don't tend to quote statistics or go into long theological ramblings with one another, or even like good theological ramblings. I mean, we tend to tell stories because that's who we are. Our lives. That's what draws people into any story. You know, they identify with a character. They want to see how the conflict resolves itself. And that's just a natural human way of understanding the world and communicating.
So help me to understand how you do this, Bob. So you've got in front of you a Bible passage, a very familiar Bible passage, perhaps Jesus telling a story. How, I mean, what's your process to get that from, if you like, words on a page to a story that really sort of captivates people's imagination?
Well, when I teach people to retell Bible stories specifically, I tell them that they first need to kind of take the story apart, if you see what I mean, like you would any story, really, any narrative. So you try and understand who the characters are, using what the text tells you initially, but then maybe, you know, doing a little bit of sort of sacred imagining, you know, what would it have been like to be in that situation. You're trying to understand the setting, the context of the story. And I think most importantly, you try and get your head around the conflict, you know, the problem story, because that's what drives the story. And I think once you've kind of taken it apart, then particularly as a preacher, then you're in a position to say to yourself, well, you know, what part of this conflict, what character in this story would most meet the needs of the people that I'm talking to? You know, who do they need to relate to? Who do they need to understand? And then you kind of begin putting it back together again on that basis. Or if I'm doing like an interactive story for kids, again, it's the same process. It's just that you're also trying to find ways that they can be involved in the story as well and help you to bring the story to life and do it together.
That's really interesting, Bob, because you've said there that you really do need a different approach from adults to that you take for children. Can you say something more about that? Why is there a different approach, and how do you sort of articulate that?
I think the fundamental approach is the same, in that you do the kind of deconstructing and then reconstructing kind of thing. So I think that's true for both of them. I think when it comes to the differences between those audiences, it probably depends upon what situation you find yourself in. So I will use a lot of stories that I've written for children initially, in an all-age context, or sometimes even, with a group of adults, if I think it's appropriate and they're willing to come along with me, with some of the interaction. You are speaking to an adult audience to approach the topic in a more mature kind of way, to maybe explore the story and help them explore the story with you, in a maybe a greater kind of depth, because you've got more time and more opportunity to relate to where they are as adults as opposed to kids.
Okay, so very much aware that those who are watching or listening to this are preachers, and that's very much our target audience. What would you say to a preacher, particularly one perhaps who's beginning their craft? What advice would you give them in terms of telling the Bible stories?
I'm a big fan of Frederick Buechner, who was, first of all, a novelist before he studied theology, and who wrote a book many, many years ago called Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. And it was a book that really inspired me when I was in seminary, because always loved and wanted to try and bring those skills to my preaching. And I think Buechner hit it on the head, because he came from a narrative background. He understood, first of all, that we need to acknowledge the tragedy of life, in whatever way that particular passage deals with it. We need to get alongside people and help them to understand that we understand their story, whatever the common human story is that kind of comes out of the passage, whether it is a narrative passage or whether it's, something more to Paul's letters. So I think we need to understand that first of all. And then he says, into that, we speak the comedy that is the gospel, the wonderful thing that happens when Jesus comes and speaks his life into the tragic events of our lives. And finally, he says, and this I think is the most profound thing in the book, he says, we need to accept that the gospel is, in fact, the truest fairy tale of them all. Not that he means it's not true. In fact, he contrasts it with The Wizard of Oz, and says that as a child, he was always disappointed because there was nothing more than a man behind a screen pulling ropes. But he said, there God does could never kind of otherworldly aspect of the gospel that makes a difference. I think it's what Tom Holland means when he talks about Christians being committed to talking about the weird stuff. In other words, not making our faith something that is just, here's a good thing to do and here's another good thing to do, but emphasizing the fact that this really is about God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves.
Hearing what you've just said, Bob, you're very much not about simplifying the story, although sometimes you perhaps might be accused of doing that. And how would you respond to that?
Well, I think again, it partly depends upon the audience, but I think it partly depends upon what you discover in the story. I mean, there's a sense in which retelling the story is all about discovery, and it starts with what you discover. So when you spend that time deconstructing the story and putting it back together, you may discover that actually there's something very basic, straightforward, and simple about it that simply needs to be stated. Boom, here it is. And really, it's not all that complicated. Or you might discover something that's really quite deep and needs a bit of, kind of working through. before you can actually be true to the text and deal with it, in that context. So I think it can go either way. I think sometimes we need to hear, oh, well, actually, it's not that complicated. Here's who God is. Here's what he calls us to do. Cool. And then sometimes when you look into the story, it's like, whoa, there's an enormous amount to be dealing with here. So it's a question of being true to the story. Yeah.
Bob, you've been talking about the power of the story, but I wonder, what about preachers who put their own personal stories into their sermons and their talks? What do you think about that? Do you have any views on that?
I think it depends how well your story helps to unpack the text and how well it aligns with the story that you're trying to get across. So if you find yourself trying to shoehorn something in, probably not. Obviously, it needs to be your story. It can't be somebody else's story. And I don't think you should do it just because you really want to tell that story. Something happened to you this week. Oh, I'd love to, if it doesn't really help the text or serve the text, maybe save it for another time when it does, and, probably not your wife's story, your kid's story. You know how it is. I mean, you need to ask for permission in those particular cases. But I do think it's all about serving the text and serving the story the story in the text as you're trying to get it across.
Okay. So in serving the story, serving the text, telling the story, what about attention spans? I mean, people have said that in this digital world, our attention spans are so much less than they used to be. Does telling a story actually get round that? Does that work in that context?
It does help. A lot of the stories that we get through digital sources are, they are stories. A lot of the information we get, they are stories. So consequently, people, while their attention spans might be shorter, they are accustomed to dealing with story in a digital setting. So consequently, if your story is well told and well constructed, then I think you have a better chance of bringing your audience along with you. But that is absolutely key. I'm a big believer in simplicity when it comes to storytelling, tightness when it comes to storytelling, knowing where you're going and sort of not wandering off the path. I think it's that sort of thing that tends to distract from storytelling in any case. I think it just needs to be tight and focused, and you need to know where you're going. And I think you will then bring your audience with you. The other thing I think that's helpful is telling the story to yourself before you tell it to anybody else. When I'm preparing a sermon, whether it's a narrative based on a narrative passage or not, I generally tend to spend the week telling it to myself. And when I teach children how to write stories, I usually start by doing oral exercises with them. So there's that self-telling going on, because I think it's through the self-telling that the thing eventually finds its way to either to notes or manuscript comes to life. But it's got to start with the self. And I think that helps to create the discipline where you go, oh, well, actually, really, I'd get bored if somebody was telling me a story and we got to this point and I was rambling on and on. So I think those two things help to make the difference.
Telling the story to yourself before you tell it to anybody else.
Yep.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm conscious that people may be listening to this or watching this who themselves like the idea of writing stories, telling Bible stories in innovative ways, and looking at your ability to do this and your success, would like to do something similar. Is there any advice you would give to those would-be writers? I
think, the first thing you need to do if you're going to retell a Bible story is to read it in the Bible. I mean, that sounds ridiculous and simple, but it's the truth. Don't base your retellings of Bible stories on somebody else's retelling, because the key thing is for you to find that thing in the story that makes you to fall in love with it. That's absolutely key. It's really hard to tell a story that you don't love and to tell it in a way that other people will love it too. And I think this is particularly true with stories that we tell a lot. I think we need to fall back in love with some of those more familiar Bible stories, which involves going into the text and being exposed to them, again, afresh, hopefully with a new set of eyes. And then once you've done that, I think it's a question of just doing it and having a go at discovering your voice and how you bring them to life. I mean, I do it in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that's how everybody should do it. That's just what I've discovered as I've tried to, deal as honestly as I can with the text. And I think other people will find other ways into it. So if what I do informs and helps, that's great. But the best thing to do is to just do it, get in there, find a text, retell the story, have a go in front of a group of people and see what works and what doesn't work. Because that's kind of how, I figured out how to do it.
Thank you, Bob. I mean, so much wisdom you've been sharing with us in these last minutes. Thank you so much for that. I wonder if you have a moment or two just to give us a practical demonstration of telling a Bible story.
Okay, I'll do this one because this is the tightest Bible story I've probably ever written, and it was done intentionally to try and just emphasize the key components, I suppose, of this particular story. I call it the 30-second resurrection, and here's how it goes. The tomb was sealed, but the tomb couldn't hold him. The guards were armed, but the guards couldn't hold him. 3 days had passed, but time couldn't hold him. The man was dead, but death couldn't hold him. Mary Magdalene tried, but she couldn't hold him. The door was locked, but the room couldn't hold him. And when he walked to the top of the hill to bid his friends goodbye, even gravity couldn't hold him. So how come we can hold him closer than a brother? How come we can hold him where 2 or 3 are gathered? Death has been overcome by victory. That's how. And even gravity is no match for love. The end.
Bob, thank you so much for that. Thank you. That was just brilliant.
Thanks.
Bob, thank you so much for your time as well, and for so much wisdom that you passed on that I'm sure will help many preachers, new preachers, mature preachers, very experienced preachers. So thank you so much for that, and bless you in your ongoing ministry. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.